the signs and the symbols of the passion of Jesus Christ and how they've kind of worked through our history and become what we recognize today as being very obvious interpretations, and they have not always been such. Remember last time we looked at this little guy, the almost graffito in Ephesus. That's the first cross, but it's definitely the Roman one with the bosses on the end of the arms of the cross. So you know where that one's from, and you know the people who put it together. As the church begins to spread out and people move other directions, particularly the Romans, who take not only their empire with them, but their new growing number of faiths with them, they get up as far north as Hadrian's Wall, remember, in England. They start running into Anglo-Saxons and people, Vikings, people who have done art all along. And from that, you will begin to see some connections, some intertwining of what is done and by whom. So this is what we'll do tonight. We'll see how things change as the art moves around the world. And John says, I can't find my glasses. I am going to have you read that. Okay.
Then I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me. And on turning, okay, thank you. I'll start again. A reading from the Revelation to John. Then I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, I saw one like the Son of Man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash across his chest. His head and his hair were as white wool, white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace. And his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp, 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun, shining with full force.
Thank you. By the time people begin to hear that verse, it's well into the 2nd century. All of the people who knew Jesus, who interacted with him, who were the very beginning of the church, are now gone. And so people have to start figuring out how they are going to express their faith, the symbols that they are going to adopt and the ones they're going to chuck out, and what they're going to do with them. This, from the Bamberg Apocalypse, which is a fairly early illuminated manuscript, but here is a very human-looking Jesus. Remember, it talks about the Son of Man in that passage. Here he is with the 2-edged sword, with the 7 lampstands, the angel with the book, and and the 7 stars. All of those things now are becoming very important in the way people start to tell the story, because it's their story now. And so they are the ones who are going to have control over telling it. On the other side is it's the Grand Vault of Pisa Cathedral, and it is Jesus in resurrection, Jesus enthroned, with Mary, his mother, on one side, and John the Evangelist on the other. If you just look at these, everybody got out safe. That Jesus ascended to heaven, and everybody is being accounted for. The early church, the 1st and 2nd century, was not so interested in the crucifixion. They were interested in the resurrection, in the promise, in the hope. Why? Because they were in very difficult circumstances. By the time this becomes popular, Nero has come and gone, Vespasian has come and gone, Diocletian, all of these Roman emperors who really start cracking down on Christianity, make it difficult, make it dangerous. Displaced people, people running, people going up into new areas of the world. They are getting away from all of that awfulness of Rome. And what they want to know is that victory is theirs. And they're not yet so concerned about how that victory came to be. Constantine, who basically converted Rome to Christianity. You can do that when you're an emperor. You can just say, y'all are Christian now, deal with it, and they do. But the more important thing that Constantine did was sent his mother, Saint Helen, around to inventory the holy sites. And she did it literally by being an oral historian. She went all over the Roman Empire and up into the Holy Land and talked to people, and people said, well, yeah, this happened here. She wrote it down in her book. And somebody else said, well, this happened over here. She wrote it down in her book. And that's really where the famous places of the Bible get documented. It's because of St. Helen's work. The center of the church then shifts away. Constantine is the last of the really great unifiers of Rome. After that, it starts really just deteriorating. And the center of the church shifts when the barbarians come in and the Roman Empire starts to lose its power, lose its authority. Its outlying areas, like England and like north part of Africa, break away. Rome is seen to be not only an unimportant city, but a ruin. Where is there a center of the church that's still healthy? It's Constantinople in what's now Turkey. And so as all this comes about, the center of the church shifts away from Rome. It goes to Constantinople and to Carthage. So we become a church in Turkey and Africa rather than Europe. And it will be a while before Europe's in any shape to do anything again. And the images change. The understanding of Jesus change. Then, as people begin to reassess from a distance what has happened and what they understand Jesus to be, they start looking at other parts of Scripture. And as they do, the symbol will start to change. And they start looking at what God is trying to tell them. They start trying to hear this. Hebrews 9, Peter says, Jesus entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. Oh, by his blood was it? Wait a minute. Before all this victory stuff, there was blood. Philippians, Paul says, who, though he be in the form of God, did not account equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking on the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and in that likeness humbled himself even unto death on the cross. Oh, maybe it's time to start figuring out what this symbol means to us and how we can understand not only our connection to God, but how Christ becomes the glue in that connection. It's not on the throne. It's not sending letters to the 7 churches. According to the letters, it's on the cross. And the first ones that become popular come under the category of crucifix. And a crucifix literally is a depiction of Christ in extremis, meaning about to die. He is in literally his last moments. And that becomes the one that the church in Rome determines they will use to be their central symbol of Jesus. My opinion of why this becomes the first one, and this is just me talking, the simplest image that can tie all of the story of Jesus together, the most direct, the most straightforward, or the most that people can get is a human being dying. They all know what that means. And they all know, even people later on in the centuries, because there were many crucifixions at the time of Jesus, but the crucifixions did not stop. Christians were crucified for over many, many decades, literally over centuries. So if you wanted to get people to engage immediately, you got to give them a symbol that hits them where they live. That was this one. And they did it for two reasons. For one thing, it was intelligible and it was easy to reproduce. But the other thing was, as the Catholic Church began to form up and make itself into an institution rather than just a ragtag bunch of believers, as they became an institution, they needed to do a couple of things. They needed to organize a hierarchy, and they needed to justify what they were teaching so that people would accept it with some authority. The center of Roman Catholic theology is the body of Christ. It's the Eucharist. If you walk into a Catholic church, that is the first thing you will see. And Father David Dehoney says it becomes the central figure because Jesus is on the altar of the cross. That's what initially in its definitions, the Catholic Church said the cross is the altar on which Christ was sacrificed. If you understood sacrifice tradition, well, yeah, Abraham put stuff on the altar. Elijah put it on the altar. Everybody put it on the altar. Well, what was the altar on which God sacrificed when? It was the cross. But if you're going to have the altar, you've got to have the sacrifice so that people understand the whole exercise. And so that's why the crucifix becomes a picture of Jesus depicted absolutely identifiably with the wounds and with everything else. Now, they're made graceful, they're made stylish, they're made elegant, because that's what you do with symbols. You clean them up, you clean up the details. But anybody who saw that symbol understood what it meant. And it also fits in Roman Catholic theology where in their understanding of the Eucharist, the bread and wine literally change into the body of Christ. That's why you can't dispose of it, whether there's any left over. It goes into a special holder in the front of the church, and as people walk by, you'll see them make the sign of the cross. You'll see them acknowledge it. That's Jesus in there. You don't mess with the image of Jesus. What that also does, though, is kind of it gave an extra legitimacy and pretty soon an overblown importance to the church. All of the theology came through the church, but the church then began to say also all of the charisms, the gifts of the Spirit, the things that allow us to express our faith, come to the church gives them to the people, then the people express them. And over time, that becomes a kind of a narrower and narrower and narrower teaching, so that pretty soon, the church is the center of everything, and it is dictating to people how they will believe and what they will believe. Well, it didn't take too long for people to get huffy about that. And early ones, John Hus, Savonarola in Italy, even guys like way later on, Grigory Rasputin in Russia, a lot of what they were doing was complaining about that control. So when that finally culminated in the group that gathered around Luther and then later John Calvin and actually rejected that theology and said, no, we are going to interpret the book of Romans to say it is not through the church that the gifts come. It is from God to the heart of the believer, and then that believer will determine how and in what way he or she expresses herself. And how are you going to change? If you're going to change the theology, change the symbol, the resurrexit, the empty cross, the one that you see on that wall, the one you see back here, and the new one that we will see very soon now when we get the new organ. The resurrection cross is the empty one. It is not just a recording of a sacrifice. But it is not Jesus sitting in some kind of grand and grandiloquent setting in heaven. This is now the church saying, here is the story. You figure out what that looks like. You figure out your symbols. Luther said, every man his own theologian, and now, thanks to the grace of the church, every woman too. But we are all our own theologian, meaning we don't have to take the symbol that somebody else imposes on us and let that symbol be the defining one. We make our own, and we make it in our cognitive mind and in our emotions, literally responding with heart and mind to what we now understand. So this is associated with institutions, but it is not one that any single institution within Protestantism controls, the way the Catholic Church has traditionally controlled the use of the crucifix. So if you walk into this church, you're going to find a cross like this. If you walk into a Protestant church that was built at a different time, you're going to have a different style of cross, because the people at that time said, this is how we want it expressed. And this is how it's best expressed in this room, in this architecture, by this community. And we will go on with that and let that be our story. And over time, the people actually begin to feel ownership of the story. It isn't the church that owns the story and teaches it to you. It is the individual who owns the story, and they come together on Sunday to share it and to celebrate it together. And that's how both in Lutheran, Anglican, and also later in Calvinist tradition, that's why the cross changes in the symbol. But that doesn't mean the institutions don't have anything to say anymore, because as, particularly in Europe, cities get richer, parishes, congregations get richer, they start building more elaborate structures and using those structures to elaborate the symbols. This is a plan of a church. It is in the shape of a cross. Most churches that you see up to about the middle of the 19th century, but certainly not too far into the 20th century, are a Latin cross plan. Catholic Church said the cross is the altar and Jesus is the sacrifice, and they made that manifest, certainly, in the Latin cross churches, but the Protestant churches do too as they begin. Now, if that's the case, why is this church a hall church? Why is this not the cross plan? Because as time moves on, people start to separate themselves from the notion that the building itself is part of the story. The building can tell the story in its imagery, but in particularly Calvinist traditions, and that becomes the dominant one in America. So even though we are still, a sacramental tradition in Lutheran history, our churches take on that very simple, humble, populist, grassroots, and anonymous kind of construction. Our building doesn't tell us anything. Our building houses our people, and our people are the ones who tell us things. And so a hall church becomes a very convenient and efficient and relatively inexpensive way, especially in pioneer villages where you had to be careful about what you built and how. That's how these things begin to be. So, starting from the Christ in glory and nobody mentioning the death, to moving into the time when people say, well, wait a minute, when you look at the Bible, it keeps talking about the cross. So we have to make that symbol relevant. We have to make it intelligible. We have to make it understandable. And in some cases, on a church or on a cross, you will see some kinds of symbols. We'll put lilies on our cross on Easter. We put poinsettias around it at Christmas. We add our own traditional symbols so that we look at it and say, oh yeah, looking right there, that's how I connect to that symbol. And that symbol is the story of my connection to God through Jesus. Some later on, you'll see yet another kind of cross, this patriarchal cross. This is not something you see here. This becomes the cross of the Eastern Church, the Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, all of those who split from Rome at the time of the Nicene Synod. And they take their story becomes different, so their symbols become different. This patriarchal cross has, this one has 2 bars. Sometimes it has 3 bars. And the basis of this is the cross that Jesus was on. Up here, that one is tended to be seen as the plaque where the symbols were said, this is Jesus, King of the Jews. In some of the more arcane ones, they'll have a bottom one too. There'll actually be 3 cross beams. The plaque, the place where Jesus was nailed, and then down below there will be the place where the nails were put in his feet, because they want to see how the body was treated. And in that tradition, making sure that they understand the wounds properly becomes very important. So their cross will tell them how they can understand those wounds. It also, though, becomes, the cross itself starts to take on a symbolism that's even more than a religious one. In the Middle Ages, it was very common to see a cross stuck up anywhere around with, it looked like a little roof over it. That was a danger signal. And that cross meant something was dangerous. The bridge is out, or the river's in flood, or something, the heathens are coming, whatever it was. Be fearful. Come to God for protection. And those kinds of crosses became very important social function. This one, the cross of Lorraine, is basically it's the patriarchal cross, but it's on a flag. During World War II, the city of Lorraine in France became an active anti-Nazi center. And they put on their flag the patriarchal cross. God defend us from these attackers. And by the authority of God, those attackers will be defeated. It's very interesting how, when you see the symbol, if you look at it very closely, it will tell you an important story. Every story is different, and every story comes out of a different kind of interpretation of the faith. But at the base of it, when you get down to the kernel of it, what it tells you is that these people standing in the shadow of this cross believe as I do at the base. Because no matter how they decorate the symbol, the content of it is the cross. I accept the cross of Christ. This group accepts the cross of Christ. The people of Lorraine accepted the cross of Christ. And it becomes not only an individual symbol, but an individual symbol that helps unify the faith and unify all of those who follow it. So, what you have here is every kind of thing. People put them on walls, they wear them around their necks, they wear them as bracelets, they put them on vases, you name it, whatever it is, that symbol becomes an immediate and engaging story that can be told in a picture as well as in a word. Now, next time, we're going to look at what happens when a cross goes into a place that doesn't know the story. How do they, when people hear the story for the first time, what kind of cross do they produce? And how does that affect them? So we will look at that next week. Ending tonight, I would like to leave you just with a last verse of Horatio Bonar's poem about the cross. It's called By the Cross of Jesus Standing. This is the last verse. Here the living water welleth. Here the rock, now smitten, telleth of salvation freely given. This is the font of love and pity. This is the pathway to the city. This is the very gate of heaven. And that